The streets of San Francisco buzzed with life as the evening conference wrapped up. Mark Zecarberk, dressed casually in a black blazer and jeans, walked alone toward the parking garage. The tech magnate was known for his unpredictable nature, but tonight he looked like any other attendee, his face partially hidden beneath a simple baseball cap. As he neared the corner of the garage, something caught his eye. A man sitting on the curb holding a small cardboard sign that read, "Homeless veteran, anything helps." The man, likely in his late 50s, wore a fraying green jacket, the kind issued decades ago in the military. His boots were scuffed, his jeans torn, and his face, lined with years of hardship, carried an expression that was calm yet distant. Mark slowed his pace, his curiosity piqued. He wasn't a stranger to seeing homelessness, San Francisco's. Streets told countless stories of struggle. But there was something about this man's composure that stood out. Instead of begging or calling out to passers-by, he sat quietly, his sign resting against his knees, his gaze steady but not pleading. Mark hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Hey," he said, his voice breaking through the quiet hum of the nearby street. "Mind if I sit?" The man looked up, surprised. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to respond, but then he gave a small shrug. "It's a free sidewalk," he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. Mark sat on the curb, tucking his knees toward his chest. "What's your name?" he asked. "Bernie," the man replied. "And you?" "Mark," he said simply. There was no flash of recognition in Bernie's expression, which Mark found oddly refreshing. For once, he wasn't being treated like a headline. Bernie raised an eyebrow. "What brings a guy like you to the curb?" Mark chuckled softly. "Just curious, I guess. You look like you've got a story." Bernie leaned back slightly, folding his arms over his chest. "Doesn't everyone?" "Fair point," Mark said. "What's yours?" Bernie studied him for a moment before speaking. "Marine Corps, served for 20 years. Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it. Got out with nothing but a pension and some scars you can't see. The pension didn't last. Neither did my wife." He gestured to the sign beside him. "Been out here for a while now." Mark nodded, letting the words sink in. "That's a tough road?" Bernie smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Could have been worse." Still breathing. For a moment, the two men sat in silence, the sounds of the city filling the gap. Mark glanced at the sign again, then back at Bernie. "You've got a calm about you," he said. "Most people in your situation would be yelling or trying to grab attention," Bernie shrugged again. "Doesn't do much good. People either see you or they don't." Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So, what do you need, Bernie? What would help?" Bernie hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why do you care?" "Because I can," Mark said simply. Bernie stared at Mark for a moment, searching his face for some hidden motive. He had met his fair share of people who stopped to talk, some out of pity, others to preach. But something about this man seemed different. Reluctantly, he exhaled, leaning back against the wall. "What would help?" Bernie repeated, almost as if testing the question. He scratched his beard, the gray strands catching the streetlights. "That's not something I've been asked in a while." Mark waited silently, giving Bernie the space to gather his thoughts. The man shifted on the curb, then gestured toward the skyline. "I had a life, you know, a real one. House, wife, 2 kids. Marine Corps kept me going, gave me purpose. But purpose doesn't mean much when your mind doesn't let you rest." "PTSD?" Mark asked gently. Bernie nodded. Yeah, it's like a shadow that doesn't go away. Every loud sound, every crowded room, I'm right back there. He tapped his temple with 2 fingers. Doctors tried to help, pills, therapy, but it doesn't change what you've seen, what you've done. Mark leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. And your family? Bernie's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze dropping to the ground. I pushed them away. Didn't mean to, but that's what happens. My wife, Janet, she held on as long as she could. But when I couldn't get a job and the bills piled up, she left. Took the kids. I don't blame her. Mark frowned slightly but said nothing. He sensed Bernie needed to get the words out. After that, it was a slow fall, Bernie continued. The house went next, then the car. I tried everything, warehouse jobs, night shifts, whatever I could get. But people don't want to hire a guy like me. He gestured to himself, the fraying jacket and worn-out boots. Once you're out here, it's like the world decides you're invisible. Mark's gaze didn't waver. But you haven't given up. Bernie chuckled dryly. You call this not giving up? He held up his sign, the cardboard edges bent and soft from use. This is survival, not living. Still, Mark said, you're here. You're still showing up? Bernie looked at him, his expression softening. What else is there? The streets aren't kind, but I've seen worse. Mark tilted his head, intrigued. What do you mean? Bernie shifted again, rubbing his hands together against the chill of the evening air. You'd think being homeless is the worst thing that could happen. It's not. I've seen good men I fought beside, lose their minds. Some of them didn't make it. Some of them ended up like me. But I'm still here. That counts for something, right? It does, Mark said, his voice steady. It counts for a lot. The 2 men sat quietly for a moment, the sound of distant traffic filling the space between them. Mark broke the silence. So, if you could have anything, what would it be? Bernie blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edges of his sign. Honestly, a chance to work again, to feel useful. I've got skills, mechanical ones. Used to fix cars, motorcycles, even farm equipment. If I had a little shop, tools, maybe some clients, I could start over. Mark nodded thoughtfully. Why? Haven't you tried? Bernie shrugged, a small, bitter smile playing on his lips. Takes money to start something like that, and out here... He gestured at his surroundings. Money's hard to come by. Mark leaned back, pulling out his phone. All right, he said, scrolling through his contacts. Bernie raised an eyebrow. All right, what? Let's start with housing, Mark replied, tapping on his screen. I know a place that can help. It's temporary, but it's clean, safe, and a good place to get back on your feet. Bernie blinked, his skeptical expression melting into one of cautious hope. You're serious? Mark glanced up, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I don't say things I don't mean. Bernie stared at him, the weight of years spent being ignored and dismissed, making it hard to believe this moment was real. But something in Mark's tone, his calm determination, made Bernie believe just a little. All right, Bernie said, his voice almost a whisper. Let's see where this goes. Mark's fingers moved quickly over his phone screen as Bernie sat in silence, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Moments later, Mark raised the phone to his ear. Hi, it's Mark, he said, his tone calm but direct. I need a favor. Bernie couldn't make out the conversation, but from Mark's side, it sounded serious. Words like emergency housing and veteran support floated through the air, each one hitting Bernie like a foreign concept. No one had spoken those words for him in years. After a few minutes, Mark hung up and turned back to Bernie. "All right," he said, slipping his phone into his pocket. "There's a place called Horizon Haven. It's a veteran support center about 10 blocks from here. They'll have a bed ready for you tonight." Bernie stared at him, stunned. "Just like that?" Mark shrugged slightly. "It's not much, but it's a start. You'll get meals, a warm place to sleep, and people who can help you figure out your next steps." Bernie's hand tightened around the edge of his sign. For a moment, his pride flared up. Accepting help wasn't easy for him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Because I can," Mark replied simply. "And because someone should." Bernie lowered his gaze, his grip on the sign relaxing. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mark said, "but I'm not done yet." Bernie's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" Mark pulled out his phone again, this time scrolling through emails. "You said you wanted to shop, right? To fix things?" Bernie nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, but like I said, that's a pipe dream." Mark tapped the screen, then held the phone out to Bernie. On it was a list of local commercial spaces for rent. "Pick one," Mark said. Bernie froze, staring at the screen. "Are you joking?" "Do I look like I'm joking?" Mark asked, a small smile on his face. Bernie hesitated, his mind racing. "I can't afford anything like this." "You don't have to," Mark said, lowering the phone. "I'll cover the first 6 months' rent. After that, it's on you to make it work." Bernie's in awe. Breath caught in his throat. He looked at Mark, searching for any hint of insincerity, but all he saw was a quiet determination. "You'd do that for me? For someone you just met?" "You're not just someone," Mark replied. "You're a Marine. You've served your country, and now it's time someone served you." For the first time in years, Bernie felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He quickly wiped them away, clearing his throat. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll try," Mark said. Bernie let out a shaky laugh. "All right, I'll try." Mark stood, extending a hand to help Bernie to his feet. "Good. Let's get you to Horizon Haven first. Then we'll figure out the rest." Bernie took Mark's hand, the simple gesture grounding him in the reality of the moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to hope. 2 weeks later, Bernie stood in the middle of a modest garage in Oakland, California. The space smelled of oil and metal, and sunlight poured through large windows streaked with dust. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with wrenches, hammers, and a variety of tools he hadn't touched in years. In the corner, an old motorcycle sat on a lift, waiting for the kind of care only Bernie could give. He ran his hand along the workbench, a mix of gratitude and disbelief washing over him. This was his shop, his second chance. It wasn't much yet, but it was his. The sign out front read, "Bernie's Repairs, Bikes, Cars, and More." Mark had made sure everything was ready to go, from the first month's rent to the initial inventory of tools and supplies. Now, it was up to Bernie to make it work. A knock on the open garage door pulled Bernie from his thoughts. He turned to see a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair holding a clipboard. "You Bernie?" "That's me," Bernie replied, walking over. "Name's Mike," the man said, shaking Bernie's hand firmly. "I run a construction company down the road. Mark mentioned you might be able to help us with our fleet." Bernie blinked. "Fleet?" Mike chuckled. Yeah, about a dozen trucks. They're always breaking down and it costs a fortune to get them serviced at the big shops. If you can handle the work, I'd rather bring it to someone local. Bernie's chest tightened, not from fear, but from excitement. I can handle it, he said confidently. Bring one in, and I'll show you what I can do. Mike grinned. Sounds good. I'll send over the first one this afternoon. As Mike left, Bernie leaned against the workbench, shaking his head in amazement. It hadn't even been a full month, and he already had his first major client. He thought back to that night on the curb, to Mark sitting beside him and asking what he needed. At the time, it had felt like a dream. Now, it was his reality. Later, that week, Bernie was adjusting a carburetor when a familiar figure appeared at the door. Mark stepped inside, wearing his usual black t-shirt and jeans, a small smile on his face. How's it going, Bernie? Bernie wiped his hands on a rag, grinning. Better than I ever expected. Got my first big client already, Mike from the construction company. Mark asked. Yeah? Bernie said, nodding. How'd you know? Mark smirked. I might have mentioned you to him. Figured you could use a boost. Bernie laughed, shaking his head. You're something else, you know that? Just making sure you have the tools to succeed, Mark said, his tone casual but sincere. He glanced around the shop, taking in the organized chaos. You've done a lot with the place. It's a start, Bernie said, his voice filled with pride. But it's mine, and that's what matters. Mark nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. One more thing, he said, handing it to Bernie. Bernie opened it cautiously, his eyes widening as he pulled out a check. What's this for? Call it a safety net, Mark said. It's enough to cover another 6 months of rent just in case things get slow. I know starting a business isn't easy, and I don't want you to feel like you're on your own. Bernie stared at the check, his throat tightening. Mark, I don't know how to thank you. You already have, Mark said simply. Months later, Bernie's shop had become a cornerstone of the community. The garage buzzed with activity, customers dropping off vehicles, construction workers chatting while Bernie adjusted engines, and even local kids stopping by to watch. Him work. The walls were now decorated with framed photos of Bernie's time in the Marine Corps, alongside thank you notes from clients who appreciated his honesty and craftsmanship. Word had spread quickly about Bernie's transformation, and one day, a local news reporter showed up to cover his story. Cameras captured the grease-streaked veteran standing proudly in his shop, speaking about the journey that brought him here. He didn't shy away from discussing the dark times, the struggles with PTSD, the loss of his family, and the years spent on the streets. But he also spoke with hope. I thought I was invisible, Bernie told the reporter. But that night, someone saw me, and it changed everything. The story went viral, with headlines praising both Bernie's determination and Mark's unexpected generosity. Social media lit up with discussions about the importance of giving people a second chance and how one act of kindness could ripple out to change lives. Mark, true to his nature, remained understated about his role. When asked about it in an interview, he simply said, I didn't do much. Bernie already had the skills and the grit. I just gave him a platform to use them. For Bernie, the experience wasn't just about rebuilding his life, it was about regaining his sense of purpose. He started offering free repairs for veterans in need and partnered with local organizations to provide training for young people interested in mechanical work. His shop became more than a business. It became a symbol of resilience and community. One evening after closing up the shop, Bernie drove to Horizon Haven, the Veterans Support Center that had been his first step off the streets. He walked in with a check made out to the center for a portion of his shop's profits. "This place saved me," Bernie told the staff. "Now I want to make sure it keeps saving others." The staff, many of whom had seen Bernie at his lowest, were moved to tears. His journey wasn't just a victory for himself, it was proof that even the smallest spark of hope could ignite a transformation. Back at the shop, Bernie sat on the same stool where he'd worked on his first repair months ago. The garage was quiet now, the tools neatly arranged and the hum of success settling in the air. He thought about the man who had sat beside him on the curb that night, asking a simple question. "What do you need?" For Bernie, the answer had been more than housing, more than a shop. It had been the chance to be seen, to be heard, and to feel valued again. Bernie's story is a powerful reminder that no one is truly invisible. Everyone has a story worth hearing, and sometimes all it takes to change a life is the willingness to listen and act. Kindness, when paired with action, can turn even the darkest circumstances into opportunities for hope and transformation.